Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back with you for session 2 of the Accreditation, Innovation, and Modernization Committee. I would love to begin by welcoming the esteemed committee members around the table by doing a round robin check-in for a roll call, and then I will turn it over to our federal negotiator. I'm going to go through primaries and alternates. Please remember to turn on your mic so that you can speak your name into the record. For students, student loan borrowers, or groups representing them, we have our primary.
Magnus Noble.
And we have our alternate.
Ryan Hofer.
Thank you. For veterans and U.S. military service members, we have our primary.
Julie Howell.
And we have our alternate.
Stuart Helgeson.
Thank you. For organizations representing workforce development needs, we have our primary.
Siri Turgeson.
Thank you. For legal assistance organizations, consumer advocates, and civil rights organizations, we have our primary.
A.D. Mudson.
Thank you. For public institutions of higher education, we have our primary.
Monty Sullivan.
And we have our alternate.
Sean de Castro.
Thank you. For private nonprofit institutions of higher education, we have our primary.
David Eubanks.
And we have our alternate.
Bill Hathaway.
Thank you. For proprietary institutions of higher education, we have our primary.
Jeffrey Bodemer.
And we have our alternate.
David Cohen.
Thank you so much. For state officials, including governors, state higher education executive officers, we have our primary, who has momentarily stepped away from the table. That's Raymond Rodriguez. And we have our alternate.
Mike Duffy.
Thank you. For institutional accrediting agencies, we have our primary.
Michael McComas.
Thank you. And we have our alternate.
Heather Perfetti.
For programmatic accrediting agencies, we have our primary.
Rebecca Busaka.
Thank you. And our alternate, Brian Kessler, will be joining us later. We have organizations representing taxpayers, our primary.
Michael Shires.
And we have our alternate.
Jim Blue.
Thank you. For nascent accreditation organizations, we have our primary.
Mark Becker.
Thank you. And our alternate, Jade Foster, will be joining us later. For National Advisory Committee, we have our primary.
Jennifer Bloom.
Thank you. We have from the Office of Post-Secondary Education for the department.
Elizabeth Daggett.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We have from the Office of General Counsel.
Jake Lallo.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have our federal negotiator.
Jeff Andrade.
Thank you, Jeff. I will be giving a few procedural reminders and updates, but before I do, I would love to turn it over to you, Jeff.
Sure. Well, welcome back, everyone. We appreciate all the proposals that came in. We took as many as we could within the time frame, but we have flagged a number of them for additional discussions and caucuses with you later today and tomorrow to make sure and see if we can find some common ground. So appreciate that. And please don't be discouraged if yours didn't make the first cut in draft 2. So today's game plan, we will go over version 2.0, which we released, I think probably like 2 weeks ago now at this point, and or maybe even 3. And we will go over those briefly, look for showstoppers. I think that discussion may take us to lunch. And then we'll start with caucuses. The first caucus will be on transfer of credit. The second caucus will be on conflict of interest and separate and independent. And then the third will be on the general references to civil rights and academic freedom and intellectual diversity and those buckets of issues. So that should give us a full day. And then depending on where we get, we'll decide sort of tomorrow and Wednesday. So this is the week before Memorial Day weekend. To be able to make it on Friday, but most importantly, my sidekick to my right over here will not be here on Friday, so I am very incentivized to try to get us wrapped up before then. So we would like to wrap things or try to get as much of a deal as we can by Wednesday. We would ask for your proposals by noon tomorrow, your sort of final set, just for planning purposes. I think we're going to have a pretty productive week. We've gone through pretty extensively the proposals and have a bunch of questions when we get into caucuses to talk about the specifics there. And with that, before I get started, I just want to make one brief announcement before I introduce Dr. David Barker, and that is at 8:45 this morning, we published or sent to the Federal Register for public inspection the Workforce Pell final regulations, which is the second in the Triple Crown of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so very happy that got done. Thank you to some of the repeat negotiators that were at the table here that worked on that package, and the rest of the folks. So one more to go for that. So very happy, and it actually broke on the secretary broke the story on Maria Bartiromo's show this morning on Fox Business. So even better. So I'd like at this point to introduce our esteemed Assistant Secretary for Post-Secondary Education, David Barker. David has been instrumental in leading this effort at the department and staying all the extra nights with us and going over the drafts. And he is intimately involved in this process and very knowledgeable. And I'd like to turn it over to David to share some hopefully words of enthusiasm and to get us through the next couple of days. David?
Well, thank you, Jeff. And good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the second session of the AIM Committee. I want to start just by congratulating Jeff. That's really an extraordinary achievement. The amount that he's delivered over these last several months. Really extraordinary work. So this is the AIM Committee. I just want to remind you that AIM stands for Accreditation, Innovation, and Modernization, a name that was very carefully chosen. I want to thank you for your work during the first session and for all of your proposals after the session. My team has been hard at work over the past few weeks, and we look forward to discussing many of these proposals over this week. It was evident during the first session that this group is committed to providing serious, constructive, and productive feedback to find common ground on many of the topics that we discussed. Negotiations work best when participants are clear about their objectives. And in that spirit, I want to be clear about the objectives of the Department of Education. Our guiding principles come from the President's executive order on reforming accreditation to strengthen higher education. Within the authority that Congress gave us in the Higher Education Act, our goal is to elevate student success as a focus of accreditation. We also need to take steps to improve affordability, eliminate illegal discrimination, and promote intellectual diversity. We must push back against credential inflation and promote innovation in the delivery of educational services. In short, our goal is to improve quality and increase affordability in higher education. Now, basic economics tells us this: the best way to improve performance in most markets is to allow competitive forces to drive innovation and change. Our proposal reduces barriers to the entry of new accreditors and makes it easier for institutions to switch accreditors that better suit their missions and characteristics. Now, some critics claim that opening the door to competition from new accreditors will lead to a race to the bottom. However, our view is that it has been the absence of competition that has caused a race to the bottom. Accreditors with vast market power have no need to distinguish themselves in holding institutions accountable. As a result, everyone gets a passing grade, and there are no checks and balances. We believe that when given a choice, high-quality institutions will seek out accreditors that signal quality to their students and their families and to the public at large. Now, in the first session, some of you expressed concerns about harmful effects of competition and innovation on students. Students are our number one concern, and we believe that competition and innovation are essential to improve higher education. If done correctly, competition will ensure that institutions can find an accreditor that is the best fit for the students that they serve. These concerns are also addressed in the complementary efforts of the Trump administration that Jeff and his group have been responsible for in other recent rulemakings. For example, in the Rise and Ahead packages, we took a number of steps to make sure that students are protected against low-quality programs that put them into unmanageable debt. In the accountability regulations, which we reached consensus on several weeks ago, we are implementing the Working Families Tax Cut Act and harmonizing existing requirements with them to create a new accountability framework that will apply to all institutions and all programs. Programs that do not help their students achieve career success will no longer be funded, period. As mentioned before, our team spent a great deal of time reviewing the proposals you submitted and benefited from many of your well-thought-out suggestions. Let me take a moment to highlight a number of the proposals that we adopted in the draft that will be discussed in depth this week. First, on separate and independent. Accreditors with market power combined with trade associations have the potential to restrict entry into professions, inflate professional compensation, and discourage innovation that would ultimately threaten the competitiveness and long-term sustainability of entire industries. Our proposal includes steps that will clarify requirements that accreditors be separate and independent of trade associations, and that will minimize conflicts of interest for all accreditors. We have also clarified the conflict of interest and due process provisions to ensure that all accreditors recognized by the department promote the interests of students and the public over those of special interests. Second, credit transfer and student mobility. Easing the transferability of credits previously earned by students is an important step that we need to take to improve college affordability. This is long overdue. As Jeff said at the last session, your discussion of the issue may have been the best that has ever happened in a public forum. Now it's time to act, and we are looking for your expertise and your commitment to improving transferability, while at the same time protecting institutional autonomy. We added the new language on credit transfer evaluation and disclosures at the suggestion of negotiators to ensure that students have the information they need to make better informed decisions when changing institutions. We also clarified the transferability provisions that they are limited to undergraduate credits, and we eliminated the prohibition on using college selectivity as a factor in decisions to deny transferability. We recognize that there will be instances where credits simply do not and should not transfer for a particular reason, and we are open to further discussion on this. But fundamentally, we strongly believe that students should not be forced to pay unnecessarily to repeat coursework for credits that they have already earned. Third, there are some new provisions. We added a definition of academic freedom to help clarify this important issue and make sure we are all talking about the same thing. We also added a section on research integrity. For many institutions, research is a core mission, yet research misconduct is on the rise. The department believes that it is important for accreditors to pay attention to institutions' efforts to eliminate fraudulent research, plagiarized research, biased research evaluation, citation rings, p-hacking, and many other forms of misconduct. We also added additional student protections at the suggestion of negotiators, including a requirement that unbiased student input be obtained during accreditation reviews and visits. A number of other changes were made to clarify regulations, conform them with statute, and address other negotiator concerns. In closing, we have an important opportunity this week to reform accreditation and higher education overall. While we have said several times that addressing these issues is important enough to move forward on, even without consensus, you have the opportunity this week to put your stamp on these regulations. We value your participation and look forward to continuing productive discussions and coming together toward consensus later this week. In the interest of getting us started so that we have a chance to break early and extend your Memorial Day weekend, I'll step aside and let you get down to business. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for setting the stage and the table in terms of what our expectations were in terms of developing version 2.0. So we are going to put version 2.0 up on the screen right now, and we will walk through it section by section in the highlighted text in yellow. Unlike in prior negotiated rulemakings, we're not having multiple colors. It'll be yellow from the previous draft, and we'll start with a version. This will be version 2.0. We will probably do a 2.1 at some point this week, and et cetera, and the changes. So the first change, and I'll give everybody a chance to get their copies, is on page 2. And that was an addition that was suggested by our student and veteran negotiators. And it's the addition of a requirement that an institution publicly disclose within 10 business days on its website and make reasonable efforts to notify all current students and graduates within the prior 5 years of any change of accrediting agency. And as we walk through this, we'll handle clarifying questions and whether or not this is a showstopper for any particular negotiator, as opposed to getting really down into the weeds. And as Mike said, I think at the last negotiating, getting into, was it Wonky Town? Wonky Town. Okay. So yeah, so not to get down too much in the weeds, but if you could identify if there's any showstoppers as we go through. So are there any issues on this particular provision?
Thank you, Jeff, for setting that up. And I just want to remind everyone, if you do have a clarifying question or you do want to identify something that is problematic for you, please use that comment card. I will call on folks in the order in which I see those go up. You will have 3 minutes. I would ask that you turn on your microphone and speak clearly into that at a reasonable pace so that we can pick that up for the live feed and our interpreters. So with that, I see Jeffrey, please.
Morning. With the disclosure on the website and making reasonable efforts to notify all current students, that seems pretty standard in what most accreditors would require. The question that I had was on the 5-year, going back 5 years for graduates and understanding the why behind that and the purpose.
I'll defer to the proposers first, and then we'll add our 2 cents.
Thank you, Jeff. Would anyone like to speak to that who helped propose this language? Magnus, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. We feel that just in general, changes to accreditation and things like that are a pretty opaque process. And a lot of times employers ask graduates about their the accreditation of their degrees or credentials. So we think it's important that accreditors, or excuse me, schools, when changes to accreditation are made, make their best effort to try to communicate with recent graduates about changes in accreditation so that they may be better prepared to answer those questions as they move into the workforce.
Thank you, Magnus. Jeff, did you want to add to that before I move on?
Yeah, I think, we viewed this as sort of trying to define more specifically recent graduates. That was the principle that we saw. We're agnostic whether that's 3 years or 5 years, but we took the suggestion here of 5.
Thank you. Jeffrey, did you have follow-up?
We would just recommend that you strike the graduates being notified. The rest of it all seems pretty standard. Just removing the graduate piece would be what we'd recommend.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on now. Mark, you were next.
Yes, I'm going to join Jeffrey and just go back to Mr. Barker's comments. If we're trying to drive down costs, we shouldn't be increasing administrative burden on institutions. because actually the institutions don't have all the contact records for all those graduates, whether it's 3 years or 5 years, and creating another job that somebody's got to go do is just adding to the cost of higher education. So I think striking the graduates is in the best interest of all parties.
Thank you, Mark. Jennifer, you have the floor.
I have a comment on a section that is not highlighted, that it continues from the prior draft. Are we allowed to continue to voice concerns over sections that aren't new?
Jeff, I will leave that up to you.
Sections that are new that we did not highlight?
No, this is not new, but there's been no attention to it since the first session. So we raised concerns during first session. It remains a concern in the second session. Are we allowed to still raise it?
Quickly.
Yeah.
yeah.
I will. So right above the section that we just considered, Romanet 3, that the secretary will not determine the cause of changing the whole unreasonable. Do you want me to finish? So that continues to be a concern. The whole A through D structure, I'm fine with A through D. In fact, I like this section in general. It's just that beforehand it says it strikes receives approval, because currently you have to receive approval. You strike receives approval, but then clearly the department is going through a process because it's going A through D. And then 3, I'm not sure to be honest with you, I would just strike Romanet 3 because I don't really understand what the situations would be. So I'm just putting on the table that I still have a pretty serious concern about just the structural pieces of that section.
Okay, yeah, we've been taking a look at that as well, particularly the double negatives and things like that in the language. So yeah, and again, I think that's more of a legacy from what the language previously read, and so we were trying to undo that. So thank you for that comment. Okay, our next is going to be on 9. Oh,
We have a couple more cards,
I'm
Jeff.
sorry.
No worries. Jeffrey, you were first.
Right. I just going back to the graduate piece. Are we taking that back or just taking the comments? I just normally you will say like, oh, we'll take that back. So I didn't know if you were taking it back or.
Yeah, we'll take that back. We'll discuss it with the proposers to see if it gives them any heartburn.
Perfect. Thank you.
But I think we've
heard
gotten everything on the table.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Jeff. Magnus, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to for the record, I was just trying to quickly review our 600.11 proposal here, and it doesn't look like anywhere in that proposal we proposed the 5-year mark. The changes that we wanted were that if an institution is seeking to change its accrediting agency or had its accreditation withdrawn, revoked, or otherwise terminated, that it makes students aware as best possible or with their most recent contact information that the institution has on hand. So just to clarify, the 5 years was not something that we specifically suggested that I can find.
Please, Jake.
Yeah, we put in the date certain just to clarify that this doesn't go back to the beginning of time. We set it at 5 years. Like Jeff said, we're open to discussing it. I would also add that, in response to several of the concerns that were raised about, the administrative burden, it does have a reasonable qualifier there. And I think that speaks to what Magnus is saying. If their most recent contact information, email, et cetera, a lot of institutions, maintain listservs of current, recent graduates that they send emails to. I don't think we expect that people would have to go create out of new cloth, but find addresses and stuff like that for students to the extent that they don't have them.
Thank you, Magnus. Thank you, Jake. Mark, over to you, and then I'm coming back to you, Jeff, to move us along.
I appreciate Jake's remark, and I agree. The problem is when you put these things into regs and they become part of accreditation, shalls become must, and mays become shalls, and shalls become must. And so adding this in here on face value doesn't seem to add administrative burden, but I assure you it will.
Thank you. Jeff, back to you.
Okay. So we'll clean that up a little bit. on page 9 is our next one. And this is actually one where I thought it was straightforward and I get all kinds of questions. Let me tell you what it's not. Striking the word peer in review in the definition does not mean we are trying to get rid of peer review. What it means is that we are looking at review as possibly broader than just peer review. It's a more of an inclusive term. So it's not intended to mean that peer review is somehow not allowed anymore. So.
Jennifer, please.
I'm sort of surprised the accreditors aren't speaking up, so I'm a little hesitant to, but I do have a recommendation for language on this one. I think it should read, to your point, because you're not trying to get rid of peer, it's an additive, you're talking additive, not subtractive. So I would do through, hold on, sorry. I lost my, okay. Voluntary, so just starting at through voluntary non-federal review, comma, by peer or otherwise, and makes, and then continue on.
We'll look at that. I am always hesitant at sort of these word salad things when something is straightforward, but if we can find a simpler way to get that point across, we'll definitely do that. But I don't want to get rid of one word and add 10 words to replace the one word. So.
Jennifer, do you?
All I'm adding, just to be clear, is all I'm adding is or otherwise. So it's non-federal review. I'm moving comma peer or otherwise. So I'm literally adding 2 words. So just, I'm not adding 10 words. The other words were yours. Or the current regs.
Okay.
Your word salad, not mine.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jeff. Michael, I'm over to you.
I mean, this is a definition. And if accrediting agencies are not defined as peer review, which is absolutely fundamental to the way that they operate, and Congress knew that when they required accreditation to be the non-federal peer review entity to do this, I'm not sure what then would be the reason to remove this, except to maybe not today, but down the road, degrade or even remove peer review entirely as the accreditation mechanism. So it is a definitive term, and it's an important one. And if what other kind of review, if not peer review, would accrediting agencies be undertaking?
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah. So just to respond to that, Michael, it's our view that peer review is not the only game in town, particularly when you're talking about future accreditors. Some accreditors may have independent reviewers that take a look at institutions. So doesn't necessarily have to be peer review. I understand that has been the tradition, and we wanted to allow other forms of it while not getting rid of peer review and not challenging it.
Thank you, Jeff. We've got a number of cards, so I'm going to work my way through them. Remember, we are inviting clarifying questions and showstoppers at this juncture. David, you are next.
Yes, thank you. And this just follows Mike's question as a clarifying question. Are we intending to preserve the essence of peer review, which is reviewed by experts, like people who are experts, or do you anticipate like automated reviews by new kinds of AI systems or something like that?
Hadn't gotten that far. No, I think we were just trying to provide some flexibility to those who had at least conceptually that we've seen out there in the public square talk about other experts looking at institutions.
So preserving expertise that, yeah, okay.
Thank you, David. Magnus, please.
Yeah, Two things. I would agree with Jennifer's suggestion, adding or otherwise, because peer review is fundamental to the process, and it's important that experts are part of that process, like Michael said. But the question I have is, can you describe another model that you've heard about other than peer review for the process that you're thinking about? I know you don't want to limit it to just peer review, so I'm just kind of for posterity's sake, do you have any other examples of review models?
Yeah, I mean, there have been people who have discussed having experts review who aren't necessarily are sitting members at an institution, that basically that they're staff and that they have expertise in that. You know, and also the possibility of bringing in, you know, people with financial expertise and other outside experts outside of academia.
And so I guess to add on to David's question, then would this preclude AI review? I think there are some risks to that, and the way that it's worded right now doesn't exclude AI, and because it's sort of broad language, and I think that we've all seen fundamental flaws in AI in terms of hallucination and other things. So I wouldn't want to open the door to that type of review because I think it leads to a lack of oversight. So just putting that.
Well, there's nothing to say that peer review can't use AI tools right now. So I don't think this change opens the door to AI, nor does it close the door to AI either. So, but again, that's not where we're coming from on this.
Thank you, Magnus. Thank you, Jeff. Michael Shires.
Thank you. As the person who proposed this one word edit, I mean, the intent is very much around this idea that there are other forms of expertise. I mean, Harvard is essentially a trust fund. And so having investment expertise as part of their campus review for reviewing policies, for example, you don't necessarily, if you have peer, the idea was that if you have peer review in there, everybody who comes into that meeting is supposed to be part of another institution that's a peer to the university. And I think that the point is that there's a lot of expertise, especially in the age of AI and other technologies that are emerging, where we can do analytics on student outcomes and all these other things, that if institutions want to rely on that review might actually necessitate the incorporation of people who may be from private firms, for example, as opposed to another university. And so that's the intent in this language. It is not about discarding the peer review process. You know, just like medicine and law and other fields, we assign expertise to the people who are in the profession. And so it's intended to respect that. And maybe the language is peer or expert review or peer and expert review or something like that. I guess the point is that it's to open the door to bringing other tools, especially in an area where we're going to have new kinds of institutions coming online who are going to require new kinds of accreditors to make sure they're producing the kind of quality that the taxpayers and the public expect.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to continue on. Rebecca, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. We support this change, but we also support what Jennifer has suggested. We don't want to alleviate peer review entirely from this document. So if it could be peer or other, we'd be very happy.
Thank you. Siri, please.
Thanks so much. I think in this context, peer means that the regulated then review the regulated. And there are so many great examples of innovation in other countries' higher education systems that have an open review to the people we just talked about, the experts and think tanks and private organizations. That's how we modernize and innovate. In between these two meetings, I went to Belgium and was on one of these. I don't need to be a Belgian academic regulated in order to provide feedback on how money should best be spent there. And the same thing here in the United States. So I think it's very important to just keep it as review, but I am open if we want to say peer and other, but I think there's no congressional mandate to have peer review. That came in here at some stage and it doesn't need to be here. That's it.
Thank you very much. Mark?
Well, to follow Siri, peer review came in at the creation of accreditation. Accreditation was created by institutions to do the review of each other for academic quality. And that's what this is about, is academic quality. The government doesn't get into it until the federal government starts funding the GI Bill and then on the, all of Title IV. So peer review, taking the word peer out of here is a tectonic shift. It is completely changing the definition of what accreditation means. I think our best and reasonable approach is to go in Jennifer's direction. However, I would add would be review, comma, peer and other relevant experts, or something where there has to be some qualifier of who else in addition to peers. The examples Michael gave can be found in peer institutions. Yale's financial officer would be fine for evaluating Harvard's endowment. But the key point is here is if we're going to go in this direction, we need to have some qualifier that keeps peer and other relevant experts. It's not just completely open to anybody or anything.
Thank you, Mark. 2 more cards, and then Jeff, I'd like to come back to you to move us along. Michael, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the other is already encapsulated in the representatives of the public. And there is nothing that prevents accreditors from having as many individuals on their boards as they deem appropriate to cover whatever kind of review peers may not be able to do. So many agencies, my own included, have individuals with specific expertise in reviewing financials, particularly for higher education institutions. And that's important because there are specific accounting requirements just for higher education institutions. And so it already exists within the current structure. We already have definitions around both representatives of the public and administrative expectations. And so taking the word peer out signals that it is no longer a defining characteristic of an accrediting body. And that is just not what, whether you want to say there's no congressional mandate, Congress clearly knew and understood what accreditation was when they required it to be the gatekeeper for federal financial aid. This is not the place, in my view, to change that. If Congress wants to change it, then that is their purview. But this is not the place to redefine what accreditation means.
Thank you, Michael. Jennifer?
So I'm really compelled by Michael and Mark's comments to make some adjustments, but I also wanted to respond to something that Michael Shire said. You sort of, when you were talking, implied as if it's only peer review. The Congress already requires that there be 1/3, what's a funny number, but 1/7, whatever. I wish it were more, but they do have a requirement for public representation. So they do require, I actually think, I've been thinking about it as everybody was talking, I actually think it would be a really good edit to keep peer and say peer and other subject matter expert, which then will get me to the next question when you move on to the public representatives when we talk about those changes. But I think it would work to say public and other subject matter experts.
Thank you, Jennifer. Final comment from Michael Shires, and then Jeff.
Thank you. I think I'd be remiss as a representative of the taxpayers if I didn't point out that one of the challenges we have with the relationship between higher education and the public interest today is that the current system has created an environment where there are unintended consequences of these choices. And to argue that higher ed as an entity is the only entity that can actually analyze and review the business practices of multi-billion-dollar corporations who are massively subsidized through tax reductions, through tax-free donations and other issues. To argue that that expertise exists because Yale also invests the exact way Harvard does, I think is a little disingenuous. I mean, the reality is that these are incredibly complex enterprises and that we need to be thinking more comprehensively about helping these institutions be who they are better in the future. And that is the accreditor's role in all of this, is to help these institutions thrive in a dynamic and changing environment. So I just wanted to raise that comment.
Thank you, Michael. Briefly, Jennifer, and then we're moving on.
I would just say that I agree with you on everything you just said. Go talk to Congress. And I would be fully supportive with you on changing the context around not necessarily the peer aspect, but certainly the public representation percentage. I would love to see it be higher than 1/7.
Thank you all for those comments. Jeff?
Okay, our next one is on 14 with a couple of conforming changes on 13. AD will decide whether we captured the essence of his comments or not on this. But we did make an addition in response to a comment proposal that we received from AD.
Michael, please get us started.
Jeff, is the intent of the walkthrough now, do you want us to go through and suggest language, or you had said you wanted proposals by tomorrow at noon? So I don't want to waste our time. I've already said what I had to say about this definition and the way that it's written. Are you open to get new language around that, or?
Yeah, we're open to language on that. Again, I think I expressed our intent was to broaden it. So I think there's points in discussions on both sides that we agree with. One, that peer review continues to be important, and two, that we need to change the model a little bit and open it up to different forms of review, and not specifically just keep doing what we've been doing for the last 100 years. So,
so my question is specifically on representatives of the public. That, right?
I'm sorry, Mike.
I mean, we can talk about peer review more if you like.
Yeah, no.
I feel like, and I guess in some ways this ties into it, because this is the area that Jennifer was just referring to on the 1/7, and you took that definition of representative of the public that I had pointed out. You had added this definition elsewhere. Now you've moved it into the definition section. Yeah. I guess what I'm asking is, do you want to just get new language as a proposal, or do you want to talk about it?
If you have new language, you can send it to me. What we just want to do, we just want to go through here is if people have questions, they can ask questions about it and they can propose something. If it's a really big problem for them, now is the time to say that as well.
Okay. So in that case, this is a kind of sort of big problem. But I guess what I'm trying to figure out is how, or what is the definition of a supplier of higher education services, and how is that different from an individual that's basically not a employee, member of the governing board of another institution? I mean, we already have that control on a representative of the public. So what other supplier of education services do we think that we're talking about here? So so I can propose new language, I'm trying to get the essence of what you're trying to capture.
If I understood the suggestion here, it was really to capture vendors in the space in terms of suppliers there. And then I think the professional in the field is self-explanatory.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jeff. Rebecca, please.
Okay, so my constituency takes real issue with this particular item because essentially it disqualifies anyone who's ever worked in this space, myself included. I've been in this space for 30 years and I have worked for vendors. And so I just think it went way too far. So if we're going to include this in the next iteration, at a minimum, there should be a cooling off period like Jake previously suggested. If it's 3 years, 5 years, so be it. We can work around that. But in the way it's written now, it's completely unacceptable.
Thank you, Rebecca. AD, please.
Just to clarify, I might be getting undue credit here. That paragraph of the currently or previously a supplier of higher education services, just trying to find, because there's too many documents. So this was in, I believe, in a previous iteration of the department's document. In our suggestion, all we were doing was moving it wasn't asking to change it. It was just simply, if you're not eliminating it, just move it. The suggestion was the rest of it, which was not adopted. So don't want to get credit, or if anyone has questions, that's not language from us, it's language from the original draft.
I'm sorry. So we took your suggestion to move it into this section.
Yeah, but the language, and they were asking where what the point is, that's not language that we drafted, that's language that you drafted.
Thank you, AD. Thank you, Jeff. Jennifer.
So I actually would really like this section strike. To me, it's completely counter to what the conversation we just had about the need for experts at the table. And this would defy that, because we're not talking about, I just want to be clear about something. When it says currently or previously a supplier of higher education services, we're not talking about like they can't be on the board of an institution, which I would understand. We're talking about accrediting agencies. So previously a supplier of higher ed services to whom? So let's just take an example. So you have an LMS. Let's just say the LMS does a lot of work, and sorry, I'm going to name names for a second, but in New England, okay, for institutions in New England. But another, I'll just say Michael's agency, decides they want to have an LMS expert because they do a lot of work with schools who use LMSs and they need that expertise. So can they not have an LMS person because that person is a supplier in higher ed broadly? It's not, to me, it's not, I don't even know how you would apply it. It doesn't make sense in the context in which it's being portrayed. And as it relates to I think the next clause only applies in the programmatic situation. And I also have issue with that because I think you're going to have a hard time finding public reps. So I take the example of a nurse who's a nurse on a floor station at a hospital. She went to a nursing school somewhere at some point, hopefully. That's why she's a nurse now. She has no affiliation with the accrediting agency, no other affiliation with institutions other than she went to one. And she can't be a public member. She's an expert. Like, she has nurse administration capabilities. Like, we don't want her to be, I want her to be on the nursing commission. Like, so it doesn't make it. So I appreciate Michael saying that he would work on language. I'm not sure I could come up with language that would work.
Thank you, Jennifer. Seeing no other cards, Jeff, I'm back to you.
And the next big set of changes is on 602.12. Page 21.
Does anyone have any clarifying questions here? Magnus, please.
I don't see, so there are some changes that have been made here for the initial submission of an application for a new accreditor, but I don't see any requirement that they've accredited an institution or program prior to submitting an application. So I'd like to ask the department, what exactly is there to look at in a potential accreditor's application if they haven't done any accrediting work prior to applying?
There is a requirement that that they have accredited someone prior to coming in.
The next page
Oh, I missed okay.
in C, I believe.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Magnus, any follow-up?
No, thank you very much for that clarification. Appreciate it.
Thank you all. Raymond, please.
Thank you. I have a clarifying question on page 22, subsection D. And I had this in my notes last month and missed it when we went through this section. It says the initial grant of recognition may not be more than a 3-year period for any agency which has less than 5 years operational history. Is it a correct interpretation that if a nascent accreditor is accredited, then instead of coming back for their authorization 5 years later, they would have to come back 3 years?
Yeah, what we heard around the table, I think from a large number of the negotiators, was that at least on the initial grant of recognition, that we would want to have sort of less runway, shorter leash, however you want to use the phrase on it, and that we would want to look at them more closely because they were new. It puts a little bit more workload on us. But I think a number of members thought that a 5-year cycle, the normal 5-year cycle was too short.
If I could follow up with a question. As I've looked through the interpretation that the Education Department put out back in February, and I looked through what we proposed here in the rules, the only thing I can see that's changed is when the clock starts in terms of when a nascent accreditor can submit to the Education Department. Unless I've missed something, and if I have, someone please educate me. Aren't nascent accreditors going through the same steps that legacy accreditors went through to receive their accreditation? They're just, the timeline has changed because of the interpretation of the federal code.
Yeah, there's really two things that have changed. One is it's the process starts early. So the 2-year rule is gone, for example. And then when you can submit changes a little bit, we provide a little bit more flexibility there for a nascent accreditor to come in. And then we've also compressed some of the timeframes in terms of response times. So that has helped addition. And I'm trying to think, and also we have a re-recognition process, which makes it more streamlined for subsequent reviews. Did I miss anything, Beth, on those? Yeah, so those are the streamlining changes that we made going forward. So I think it definitely helps speed up the time when we can bring a new accreditor on board.
I agree with that. I'm just wondering if nascent accreditors are still checking the same boxes legacy accreditors checked in order to be recognized, then why would we have them come back sooner for reauthorization? I'm not sure that's necessary, but that's my 2 cents.
Okay. Thank you, Ray. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Jeff. Jennifer, please, you have the floor.
I'm one of the ones who raised concerns in the last session, so I'm happy to answer Ray's question. The reason is because with new accreditors and it is peer review, if they're only accrediting, let's say, and I have hesitations, it's not a fall on our sword, so I'm not going to waste time on it, but I even have a hesitation with the 5-year comeback. And, I'm sorry, if you've been in business for 5 years, because if in your first 5 years, for example, or as a nascent accreditor, you're only accrediting a few institutions, and in the next 5 years, you only add 1 or 2, that's not showing a great situation for peer review. We've seen that concern come up at NASIKI. And so I think it's really important to have a touch point to see what is going on with the accreditor, whether they're having success in having other institutions or programs join them or not, and not spending time, because there are real issues that can come up, as we have seen, where an agency doesn't have the financial resources. They're only relying on the accreditation of 3 schools. Peer review becomes bad at that point. And so in the early stages, I find it very important to have a comeback. The reason I had my card up is I just want to point out, in case I forget later, the recognition section needs to be adjusted to conform here, because we talk about the timing of when people put in their applications, agencies put in their applications, and the language doesn't account for the scenario of a 3-year cycle. So there needs to be like a clause added or a subsection or something later on. So I was scared I was going to forget that. So I just wanted to reference it here.
Thank you, Jennifer. Michael, please.
Thank you. Launching a new accreditor is an expensive and complicated proposition. And it strikes me that this shortened time frame, if you think about only being able to process 2 or 3 more institutions, for example, through that process, because it's the transaction costs of an institution changing are very high, that you're not going to get a lot of new information in forcing them to go through an entire new review. So I actually kind of want to borrow from the accreditation world in some ways and propose that instead of a 3-year cycle, you have a 5-year cycle, but you have a 3-year report that would have key indicators to make sure that the scale of the accreditor or whatever else is growing appropriately, and that there's at least a sign that we don't need to take action, or that the NASIKI doesn't need to get involved. And so I'm not sure about all the statutory details in that recognition process, but it strikes me that that might serve the same purpose without, think of the burden of submitting that full report for those of you and accreditors who've gone through it, doing that again, and actually putting a new competitor at a competitive disadvantage with the other folks who don't have to bear that extra overhead cost.
Thank you, Michael. Jeff?
Yeah, just to clarify for the record, and I just made sure that I was right when talking to Beth on this. We have a tremendous amount of flexibility, even on initial accreditors, both NASIKI and making the recommendation, and the SDO in terms of making a decision. So we can require reports through a normal process. Originally, when we had proposed this, we thought we had discretion to do 3 years, or to do less than 5 years anyway, if the situation warranted it. And we heard a lot of concerns and showstoppers from people around the table that under no circumstances should it be beyond 3 years. Again, we would like to tailor it to the situation and to the agency, and in terms of any kind of oversight, because there are differences. I mean, there are some that have very ambitious plans, and there are going to be some that are going to take it a little bit more careful and conservative approach in terms of how they scale up. So, like I said, I think we have flexibility to do what you're saying, Mike. And again, we don't normally constrain ourselves, but we saw this as something that we were willing to give. And obviously, if we don't reach consensus, we wouldn't have this language in there. And unnecessarily constrain ourselves. We put it in because we thought people thought it was important for reaching consensus. So.
Thank you very much. Jeff, Mark, you were next.
Well, I'm going to agree with Mike. So we're friends now. Again, Mike. But yeah, and Jeff, with your clarification, I just think it makes it obvious. It should be 5 years. The standards are what the standards are. And if the department sees a reason to have any additional judgment, or NASIKI does, it already has that mechanism. To put it into the regs just seems ridiculous because they're being held to the same standards.
Thank you, Mark. Magnus, please.
Yeah, I think Julie and I were on the same wavelength here. I apologize, but I would like to go back to my previous question on C. So under C, it says you must have granted accreditation prior to being granted recognition. Under the requirements for applying for recognition, it says that you must have an application from one institution or program. So I just want to clarify, is it the department's intent that an accrediting agency accredit a program before submitting the application to the department?
No.
Then what are you reviewing if they haven't done that, I guess, is to go back to my question, in the application?
Well, I mean, we would obviously expect that the agency has been conducting, and I apologize, Kayla, I just jumped in there. We would expect that the agency obviously has been conducting accreditation activities.
Mm-hmm.
We would be looking at, and we took a lot of this language from the current institutional accreditors and from your proposal as well, that they are, legally established, that they've adopted standards, that they have operating procedures, that they have established to, accept applications, and then they must undergo the entire process. So we have to have a way to be able to determine that they are a reliable authority. I think that they could have gone all the way up to as close as possible to have conducting that review. And it could be that they had an institution or program that came before the decision-making body and was deferred or was denied. So they haven't actually granted accreditation, but they could be at a point where they have made decisions, and maybe those decisions were the ones that they should make. So I think that we wanted to leave the discretion there, but obviously to be considered, they have to, I think for by the NASIKI, the minimum was that they had to have undergone the process and, I'm sorry, for, undergone the entire process before they could be reviewed by NASIKI.
Okay, so the intent is just to try to speed up the process
Yeah.
a little bit beforehand. Okay, appreciate the additional clarification. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus. Thank you, Elizabeth. Siri, please.
Just briefly, I want to agree with the comments so far that speak to a streamlined rather than a full review. And in that case, if the department can request these reports, then I think we can remove this 3-year language. That's it.
Thank you, Siri. Jennifer?
I definitely don't support removing the language. There is higher risk with newer agencies than there are with existing agencies. So there is a difference right out of the gate between agencies that have been around for literally 100 years and one that's been around for 5 years. Or less than 5 years, actually, in the case of the 3 years. So I definitely feel like the language needs to stay in. Having said that, I would be supportive of a proposal for language that required it be a monitoring report. I don't feel like it has to come before NASIKI necessarily. The department can use its judgment in a monitoring report, but I absolutely don't want to leave, no offense, the discretion to the department in that first initial accreditation of whether it is a full 5-year or a monitoring report. I think it is a good regulatory change to require a monitoring report after 3 years, or whenever you decide, but that there be a monitoring report somewhere, an interim monitoring report, and that you guys can then decide whether, they're not looking so good, they need to come before they need a full review or not. So that's what I think the compromise is we're looking for compromise.
So to understand, so you would be supportive of a full 5 years, but require a monitoring report
in the interim?
In the interim?
Yes.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jeff. Michael?
Thank you. This is my proposal, so I'll just, I can get on board with the monitoring reports but I would just say this. I mean, I think this is a risk issue. And so it is meant to, protect, students and taxpayers as the gatekeeping responsibility. I'll just tell you from my experience as an accreditor doing this for 3 decades, we limit the first term on an initial applicant school because our experience is that when they first come in, the first thing they want to do is grow, change, become eligible for federal financial aid. All these things happen in the first couple of years. And if they're not resourced properly, then what we found in doing a study in this is that there was a disproportionate number of warnings and probations and even withdrawals for institutions in their first cycle of accreditation. So, it just, for us, my rationale behind it was strictly risk-based review. As someone that has gone through the recognition process many times, yes, it is onerous, but it's not debilitatingly so if you're properly resourced to do so. And if you've just done one 3 or 4 years ago, much of it should be just continued reporting on your activities. The only other thing I would say is also, while we've outlined a very streamlined process here, that doesn't mean that every institution or every agency is going to be able to go through it streamlined. It could be years in between the actual reviews. So constraining that a bit because when you're a recognized agency, there is no flexibility. You go through on the schedule that the department puts you through. But if you haven't reached a milestone yet in the initial process, it could take a much longer time before you get thrown out. So it could be 6 years between your initial application and when you finally get recognized. So to me, it makes sense to put an initial kind of delimiter around it so that everybody's on the same playing field, same stage. And having gone through the recognition process, I don't find it to be so cost prohibitive or inappropriate to ask institutions to do that. Last thing I would say is they may only be doing 2 or 3 institutions the first time through, but they could shoot up to 20, 30, 40. You want to keep a very close eye on that kind of activity.
Thank you, Michael. Jeff, back to you to move us along.
Okay. Our next set of changes, if we're done with this, we'll go down to page 24 and 25. And that's just really making changes that clarify that this applies to expansions and contractions of scope of recognition. Okay. Any cards up? Doesn't look like it. Okay. So our next one will be on page 39. Yeah, I'm sorry. And that is just a reference that I think we had agreed to put in the preamble with regard to what we mean by officers and directors.
Rebecca, please.
Yeah, Jeff, can we go back to page 27 under 602.13B, where it indicates recognition does not authorize collective action? I noted that in 602.28, there were revisions that mandate, 602.28 4D, that mandate accreditors, programmatic specifically, to mirror the institutional adverse actions, which, it seems like this could become really problematic for the programmatics with antitrust. So I'm just curious, have you considered the implications of these changes on 602.28 4D?
I'm sorry, you said page 27 and then 602.
Yeah, so this is
602.13.
602.13B, where it indicates that recognition does not authorize collective action among editors, but then there is provisions around collective action in 602.28 4D. So I'm just pointing this out. Maybe we rectify it when we get to 602.28 4D, but the new language very specifically requires programmatic accreditors to mirror the institutional adverse actions.
Okay, we're going to have to take that one back because you stumped the feds on that one.
Okay.
What was the section in 28 that you were referencing, please?
4D.
I'm sorry?
4D.
4D. Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer, please.
Yeah, sorry, but I just want to raise and just flag, just because part of the exercise you said was flagging, sort of serious concerns. So page 31, the whole decision-making body being separate from the commission I don't think I need to say anything else, but that continues to be a serious concern.
Yeah, and we will have a discussion in caucus on that, on the conflicts of interest and separate and independent.
Okay.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jeff. Michael?
Insofar as 602.13 is new and the effect of recognition, I'm wondering, and there's much in here about where, agencies, the Department of Education has expectations that agencies get it right. And that, that institutions have, opportunities for due process, to make allegations that, the agency improperly followed its process. But I wonder, and what is far more the case, that agencies do get it right, and prevail in court and prevail in arbitration or whatever the case might be, whether or not there's any room here or the department has any appetite for indemnification for accreditors as an effect of recognition.
Go ahead, Jake, please.
I want to be clear on what you're saying. You want us to indemnify accreditors in case of what precisely? What's the indemnification covering, I suppose?
Well, a specious lawsuit where, again, the accreditor prevails, or some kind of other, the stakes are high for accreditors to get it right, obviously, which, again, in most instances they do. But it's also a very costly proposition, and 10 out of 10 times the reason that a creditor is being sued is merely to maintain their eligibility for federal financial aid. So, it's some form of protection for a triad partner that is taking on all the risk in that process.
I think we can look at that. I don't believe that we have statutory authority to indemnify accreditors. Frankly, I'm not really sure that we can indemnify anybody under the HEA, but we are cognizant of the risk accreditors have to take there, and the fact that accreditors do face lawsuits from institutions on these kind of matters. So I think you're raising a really valid concern, and we can look at ways to protect accreditors a little bit more in the process, but I don't think we can go as far as indemnification.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I talked to Diane about it as well back in the last 2019 one. I think we came to the same kind of conclusion. I thought maybe a light bulb moment may have occurred, but yeah. No, but it is a very costly aspect of what you're really asking for gatekeepers to do here. So something to think about.
Thank you, Michael. Jeff, back to you.
Okay, we're going to go to page 41. So these were changes that we made in response to comments on the last one to clean up this language a little bit.
Thank you. Michael? Does anyone have any clarifying questions here? Michael, please.
Sorry. Again, would you be open to a little bit of language here to clean up some of the way, instead of, the agency conducts its accreditation, activities in a manner that seeks to avoid unnecessary financial compliance and administrative burdens and things of that nature, as opposed to a cost-effective manner, which is very vague and open to much interpretation by the department staff down the road?
Sure. Yes.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jeff. Jeff, I'm going to turn it back over to you to go to our next session, as there's no additional cards.
Okay. Our next set of changes are on page 54. And this is what Dr. Barker spoke about earlier this morning in his opening remarks. It's a definition of academic freedom, so that when we're discussing this issue, we have defined the term, and a generally used, it reflects how the term is generally used in academia.
Thank you, Jeff. Jennifer, please.
So I'm going to go way broader than what you just said, Jeff, just to discuss 16 and 17. So this was language that, so we spent a lot of time on 16 and 17. And one of my questions for the caucus this afternoon is I noticed that you mentioned academic freedom and other issues. You didn't discuss at all structural issues around student achievement standards. And so I would just put on the table that we need either an open conversation, which I'm fine with, or a caucus to discuss the structure of 16 and 17, because we had, I thought, pretty good conversations in the last session about how we might resolve some of the issues of the original 16. But now I can no longer support what's in 17, the way it's written. And a number of us spent a lot of time after the first session putting together a pretty robust, I would almost call it a gift, on how to handle 16 and 17 that was sort of left on the cutting room floor. And you mentioned addressing, which I'm all for, addressing the academic freedom and those issues, but there's more to these sections that are problematic than just the academic freedom and those subjects. So I just wanted to flag that the issues go well beyond those issues.
Thank you, Jennifer. AD, please.
Now that we define academic freedom, and maybe I should have flagged it before, but should there be a religious exemption that relates to either, I'm not sure if it better belong on page 50 or here, just so that the academic freedom does not imply that that would trump the religious mission or of the institution. That's something the department's comfortable with.
Yeah, I believe we have protections in that elsewhere, and we've defined it. I mean, what we're talking about here, and I think to Jennifer's point, we probably couldn't even make this even more specific. I mean, academic freedom really speaks to standards around faculty and research, primarily. And that's, as Jake's talked about in the previous session, there's a lot of case law on that as well. And there's definitely a delineation between public and private institutions in that regard.
Any brief follow-up before I move on, AD?
Just again, I don't know if the department wants to comment on whether or not if the other sections which talk about religious exemptions or if they don't apply to this, could we clarify that it would?
We don't think that it's necessary here. These are institutional policies that the accreditor is ensuring the institution has one and follows their own policies regarding it. So if an institution is a religious institution and has specific, rules in place regarding that, presumably we would assume that they're enforcing them consistently. That's basically what we're asking accreditors to do here, is to check that institutions are actually enforcing their own policies and not, punishing faculty accordingly. If a religious institution has more constraining policies regarding academic freedom, that's their prerogative, so long as they, again, they're being enforced consistently. So really, we're just asking the accreditor to check that the academic freedom policies that the institution has are being followed and enforced consistently.
Thank you. David, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Following up on Jen's comment, on page 51, the must that is in the new language that applies to student achievement metrics at the program level is a pretty big deal for us because, well, for two reasons. One, it adds huge burden for people who do my job, basically. It would amount to a scavenger hunt for lots of metrics, some of which that will not apply. So beyond the burdens, then there's the effectiveness question, and I think this actually takes us in the wrong direction. For many years, we've taken the approach that we need to collect a bunch of data, and I think it's been under the assumption that once we have it and look at it, that truths will reveal themselves, but that hasn't happened. And I think we need to move from asking what's the situation now that we have lots of data to why is this occurring and what are we going to do to improve it? And so this doesn't take us in that direction. And as my James Madison colleagues are fond of saying, weighing the pig doesn't make it fatter, and we're just weighing it a lot more here. So there are lots of technical problems with this. Just from a statistical point of view, most of our improvement opportunities are going to be hierarchical between the institution and programs. So it doesn't make sense to disaggregate everything to the program and imagine that that's going to reveal stuff. Programs can be very small, and so on and on and on. So I hope we do have a caucus that can, dig into these issues, because I do think there's an opportunity to improve student achievement rules here. I very much hope that happens, and I think we can adjust this. Thank you. Oh, the other thing, do I have time left? Page 55 on the discussion of academic freedom, part 2. They're thinking here as a peer reviewer, how would I know if material is germane to the subject of the course being taught? I'm just thinking about how complicated that might be. What sorts of evidence would I look at?
As Jake pointed out, we're looking at the policy here and the applications of the policy. So the expectation is that the policy will discuss. We'll have provisions with regard to research, and that they get at those, and that those policies get at those elements.
Okay, so as a peer reviewer, what I might see is here's the policy, and either we've never had an opportunity to apply the policy, or we might get evidence that it has been applied, and we review the evidence and make sure that the policy was followed, not that there was material germane or not. Is that right? Great. Thank you. Last question, just clarification. Part 3 on page 55 in that section seems to give some flexibility and then take it back away again. If you could just talk about what the intent is for number 3, that would help.
So I think the intent here is to say that the policies can go further, and that there's nothing here limiting that, except to the extent that they're consistent with existing case law.
Want to add to that?
I think to put it like plainly, I think it's like Jeff said, you can go further with your policies on academic freedom, but we don't want you to go so far right you end up going left. And then basically it becomes a way to, curb debate. So it's basically just ensuring that institutions, they can create whatever policies they want regarding academic freedom, but it doesn't also get used as a bludgeon within the institution to curb debate. I realize it's a little circular, but you could certainly craft a policy that's drafted in a way that does seem on its face to encourage protections, but then actually gets used to squelch debate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Jeff. Julie, you have the floor.
Thank you. I just want to echo the sentiments that I very much look forward to a caucus to address these sections, because I still have quite a few problems, and I say that as someone who is not the accrediting expert. So if it's a red flag to me, I can only imagine what is buzzing off in other people's heads. I do just want to draw attention to Romanet 2, Section C, and maybe I'm being an alarmist here, but speak and write as citizens, I have problems with that language.
Can you tell us what page?
Julie, can you please point everyone to specifically what you'd like us to look at?
Page 54, Section C, Romanet 2. And thank you to the last negotiated rulemaking where I learned the term Romanet. And maybe this is my very pedestrian understanding of all of this, but write and speak as citizens is problematic language for me. not everybody that participates in any of this is a citizen, and maybe we're using that as a generic term for a person, but I would recommend that we find something way different than that to articulate that.
Would you be good with individuals?
Sure. Citizen has a very specific connotation to it, and we're seeing that word play out in different ways through different agencies right now that I don't want that to impact higher education the way it might be for other departments.
Thank you, Julie. Jennifer, you have the floor.
Yeah, so I spoke earlier about the structural issues, and now I am going to talk about the academic freedom, the question. So I am very concerned this would be a high priority problem with the inclusion of a definition of academic freedom in a regulation. I just feel like it's actually, to me, there's a huge irony to it that this administration would intervene in what is very traditionally a governance issue between an institution, its board, its faculty. And it's a, really important principle. To me, this is highly burdensome for the accrediting agency to try to interpret the applicability of the definition that was written. The definition that was written is not consistent with AAUPs, and so it's going to be inconsistent with a good chunk of American colleges and universities around the country. I think, and I said this in the last session, and I really hope the department will go back to this, and maybe we can talk about it in caucus, but the executive order itself has actually quite good language about intellectual diversity, and I feel like that language will it does provide a really good roadmap for regulatory language that could literally just be mirrored. I mean, you could lift from the executive order and place into the regulations, and we would be good to go in the context of academic freedom. But having a definition that's inconsistent with what we all considered to be, it has the same principles. I don't want to totally, so it definitely has the same principles. It's just that we've all been working under, and each individual institution, as you sort of said, Jake, works in its own fashion to organize and comply with academic freedom. I definitely agree there is a role for the accreditors. I want to be clear that I'm not opposing the concept that in the review of compliance, that's a really good role for accreditors. It's just by providing a definition, you're actually making it worse for the accreditor and the institutions and the students and everybody else, and not better, and not getting to the right place where I think actually we might have consensus on the concept.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jeff, did you want to respond?
Yeah, we hear you, Jennifer, on that. And again, I will point back to the last meeting where people had different definitions and different understandings of the term academic freedom. So the intent here was to put something that is, I think by most, the average person will look at this is fairly innocuous. This doesn't regulate it. It essentially tries to define something that is already out there. Academic freedom is an important part of case law. And again, this gets to the protections for faculty members, which are an important part of the educational process and the educational standards. And again, the intention here is not to make institutions or accreditors do anything more than what they're currently, what they should be doing now, which is looking at how institutions treat their faculty and the protections that those faculty work under, both from a research standpoint and from a classroom standpoint.
Very briefly, please.
So I would actually go a step further than what you just said. It also, because you didn't mention intellectual diversity for the benefits of the student, which I think is incredibly important. And I think, I'm not sure, I get the problem. I don't want to go into a rabbit hole of what the problem is that we're solving for, because I understand why the department cares about situations recently. I get it. Having said that, in recognition of the fact that, as you just acknowledged, we have principles of academic freedom that exist. We have accreditors that should be reviewing. And I think we can write this in a way where that's clear without going the step further of the federal government putting into regulations a definition of something that this higher education system has done independently for a long time. And so if you want to beef up and clarify the accreditor review of what happens on college campuses, I'm okay with that without a definition of what academic freedom is, because each college does this differently, and I applaud that. Academic freedom means something different in a vocational environment, in a teaching realm, than it does at an R1 institution. It's different. And so they need that space to be able to apply academic freedom in the context in which they are teaching. And so to put a federal regulation ties the hands of the accreditor and the institutions to some degree, but ties the hands of the accreditor to try to figure out what compliance looks like in a context that doesn't make sense.
Thanks everyone for your continued patience. Jeff, Jake, any response from you before I move on?
Yeah, just quickly. The federal courts have decided what academic freedom is, not higher education coming up with this themselves. Higher education has tried to implement what federal court decisions have ruled in this area, but there's definitely a federal role here. So I don't want to have a presumption that this is something that's strictly within the realm of academia. And this definition doesn't get prescriptive. This definition is based on the case law, on the protections. And again, the goal here is not to define what academic freedom is. It's to essentially talk about what the protections are for, and recognizing what it is out in the field, in general. So it's not creating something that's not already there. It's describing something that currently exists within the realm of case law, to make sure that when we use that term, that everybody's using the same consistent term.
Thank you, Jeff. Jake?
Yeah, and the other part of this is to provide some degree of surety for the accreditors too. I understand the concern about putting accreditors in the position of what regulating academic freedom means. By providing a definition, this is basically, when we first came to this, it was you have to have a policy regarding academic freedom, or we want to ensure that accreditors require their institutions to have some kind of policy regarding academic freedom. This is really to handle the situation where it's reactive, where you're getting complaints that the institution isn't following its own policy, or a professor is levying some kind of issue that they're seeing with the institution. This is giving the accrediting agencies something to point to, and some standard to go off of when they're conducting that review. So it doesn't look arbitrary, and it's not something that they have to fully make up out of whole cloth. This is something to point to and work from a rubric of when determining compliance with the institution's or ensuring that the institution is following its own policies.
Thank you, Jake. I have noted a number of cards and I've captured the order in which they've gone up, but we are at 10:36. Would we like a quick break? Let's take 15 and be back. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and welcome back from our break. We're going to pick up where we left off. I had noted before the break a number of cards and jotted those down. Jeffrey, would you get us started?
Thank you. Yeah, going back to page 51, we were talking about outcomes and specifically talking about the language that had changed from session one to at some point in mid-session one and now to what we're receiving today. We would really prefer to go back to the language that says may include but not limited to, and then the list that's there. And also we would like to recommend to the department to strike Romanet 3, which I also learned that word from my first negotiated rulemaking, on the graduation outcomes, including employment, since that seems to be putting additional burden on the schools since the earnings premium was just simply passed a few months ago. Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you reference the page number again?
Sorry about that. Page 51. This is where the word became must, and previously it was in the proposed text as may include but not limited to. And it went through state licensing and then program retention. And then at the top of page 52, striking Romanet 3, where essentially it was requiring schools to track employment information, given that the earnings premium is now part of regulation.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
All right, Jeff, thank you.
Okay. Magnus, you have the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that as a student, especially one who's participated in institutional level board governance, I do have some concerns with adding in a definition into the regulations for academic freedom. Although I'm not an expert on it, and I'd largely defer to some other negotiators at the table. But I do think I have some concerns and looking forward to caucusing on that.
Thank you, Magnus. I'm going to keep moving on in cards. Mark.
So following Magnus, really coming back to Jen, is, I read this, and having spent my entire professional career in universities before retiring, I don't see the conflict with the AAUP document here. This actually, as written, seems to me to be a very simple synthesis of what is an otherwise long and misunderstood document, having had many conversations on the matter with executive vice presidents and provosts, as well as faculty members over the year. But I don't see the conflict with the AAUP document, and I don't see the conflict with the way that this tends to be interpreted in the institutions that I've been affiliated with. I think what's new here is the intellectual diversity comment, which I take as a positive, that it says it will not be in conflict with academic freedom as I read it. So I just want to be on the record for that.
Thank you, Mark. Jeff, I may have missed your card, please.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a better sense, and I think this goes to Mark's point a little bit, and from the opposite perspective, what the concerns are that are being expressed, because we don't see this definition in conflict with what's commonly used and commonly discussed out in the field. And nor do we see it as inconsistent with case law. So I'm trying to get a better understanding. If we're going to talk about academic freedom, why it's better to not define it and have a bunch of people having 20 different people having 20 different opinions of what that term means versus having a single definition that comports with what's commonly used in academia and what's commonly understood in the case law, and that everybody is on the same page. So if I can get a better understanding of what the concerns are.
Thank you, Jeff. Jake, would you like to speak to that too?
Yeah, I'd just like to add a quick clarification. To your point about the AAUP document, we cribbed from that. We looked very heavily at AAUP, and we thought that was particularly important because AAUP also figures in to those academic freedom cases. And so, to the extent that this policy is something that's commonly understood throughout higher education, we liked that because it comports with the case law and because it's a standard that institutions are already aware of and use quite heavily.
Thank you, Jake. I'm going to continue to go around with cards, and if anyone wants to speak and include in their time a response to Jeff's prompt, I'd appreciate it. Ray, you were next.
Thank you. And I just want to echo what Mark said. My review of the academic freedom definition compared to the AAUP definition looks to be remarkably similar, with the difference of you've added the viewpoint diversity portion at the very end. And I think that's very important. I said this at the last time we were gathered, and I'll reiterate it for the record. Since the last time we've gathered, there have been a couple of academic studies that have gotten some notice, and one of them looked at 367 academic journals going back 4 decades in the subject of social science. And it used AI to do an analysis of were the articles, the research done on topics that are on the left politically or on the right. And what the research found was that 90% of the articles that were politically relevant leaned to the political left. Every single journal, every single year. And we all know that research drives curriculum. This is happening now under current education department rules and under current legacy accreditor standards. Another study that came out looked at open syllabi. It used AI to look at the millions of syllabi that are on OpenAI and to do an analysis on the 3 most controversial topics: race, Israel, Palestine, and abortion. And the question was, if articles from experts who are considered the author of the canon are utilized in the course, are their scholarly opponents who have published research also part of the course? And what they found is no. The most commonly cited article appears by itself 96% of the time with nothing on the opposite side of the scholarship being presented. But there are other articles supporting that political perspective that are being presented. That was on the subject of race. I could give you statistics on the other, but I don't want to waste your time. My point is, right now, under our existing framework, even though we have a long had an understanding going back to Supreme Court decisions that universities are a marketplace of ideas where there should be a variety of viewpoints being presented to the students so that they learn how to think critically, the evidence shows, looking at the actual syllabi and the actual academic publications, that that is not happening. And so it's our responsibility to make it clear to accreditors, legacy accreditors, and any new accreditors that will come into the market, that that is our expectation in the future. And I think this is the most elegant way to do it. So I support what's been done here.
Thank you, Ray. Jake, please.
Ray, I think you raise an interesting point. And I actually want to push back a little bit. I actually don't think that this would necessarily solve the issue that you're addressing to some extent. It's not going to force, universities to somehow become a 50-50, both sides of the aisle debate forum. What it will do, though, is ensure that anyone who, like professors within a university who choose to research or conduct research on topics or take, positions that might be contrary to the particular bent of their institution, are not punished for doing so, so long as they're still within the academic freedom policies of that institution. It protects professors. It provides accreditors something to look at. And I think you lay out an interesting point that, it really is something that we want accreditors to take into consideration while looking through this and ensure that their institutions are following it. But I don't want to, make the suggestion that this is basically going to be in any way requiring institutions to somehow change the way they're teaching, or that we're going to cause an entire field to suddenly become, completely contrary, or you can just do whatever you want within the field. It's not that at all. It very much is, though, ensuring that professors who are doing research are actually given the protections that we would expect in a marketplace of ideas, and allowing them the freedom to push back within, the proper confines of the institution and in their personal lives.
Thank you, Jake. Jeff, did you want to add to that?
And not that I would ever dispute anything that my counsel says on this, but the one thing is that I mean, Ray, to your point, I mean, we do know that there are institutions that are over the line on this and that are actively trying to suppress viewpoints, both sides of the aisle. And so I think this gives additional protections to faculty members to pursue those cases, because if you look at the case law, to Jennifer's point earlier, the case law that we have on this, and when we talk about academic freedom, this is the result of litigation between professors and their institutions. That's how we got here. And so it's something that has been fought for over the years, and I think that people will continue to try to protect and act in their own interests. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, Jake, and Ray for that. Michael Shires, you have the floor.
Thank you. I think there's another perspective on this definition of academic freedom on page 54, and I know we're going to have a caucus about it, so I won't dive into the details. But it actually constrains the federal government. It says this is our definition of academic freedom. We can't pursue things that aren't in this definition. I think it's helpful from that perspective for setting a standard. And Jake talked about providing cover for accreditors with respect to institutions, but it also provides, I think, clarity to accreditors about the issues that the federal government will touch on and actually sets some specific guardrails around those. And so I like the fact that it's here. I mean, maybe we'll wordsmith some stuff this afternoon, but I do like the idea that the government's clear about what it means when it waves its hands at this issue.
Thank you. Michael, you have the floor.
So I think I'd mentioned this in the previous session and also in some proposals and also in the HED committee. And that is that it's difficult for accreditors to find reliable wage data. And although you've clarified, as available here. And so I was, really, thinking that, that using something like the annual earnings premium that the department has developed will be a very useful tool for accreditors in making assessments about things like educational and economic returns. And so I had suggested in the proposed revision to rely on the annual earnings premium as which is already going to be a measure that the department is using, a measure that the public and accreditors can rely upon, that uses what I think is reliable wage data insofar as it comes from the IRS, probably any better data than we could find in other resources. And so I would just, again, encourage the department to think about on page 52, Romanet 5, that that should be, at least one that we want to call out. I mean, I think Jeffrey mentioned it for Romanet 3, but it also applies to Romanet 5 probably even more directly, and would encourage the department to accept the recommendation to allow accreditors to simply rely on that.
Thank you, Michael. Jennifer?
So I put my card up in response to Jeff. So I just want to say, I think this is a good conversation. I think it's a bit circular on the academic freedom piece, because I think we're all, I don't think anybody's debating, and I think I even said that I don't love the language, but I actually did say that it was close to AAUPs, but there are word differences. And I've been sitting here, I have my little cheat sheet. I have AAUPs policy here and language. So undue influence. Undue is not an AAUP. So teach without undue interference. There are word choices and wordsmithing. So there was cribbing, but there were word changes that are not consistent with AAUP's policy. So undue influence is the word undue, or undue interference. So the word undue puts pressure on the accrediting agency in a way that I don't think, in the context of academic freedom, we have intended. Jeff's pointed out the courts. Honestly, that's the way our American system works, is things get debated between the faculty and the college and then hopefully not litigated, but potentially litigated. And that's all to the point of how we're organized as a country. So the federal government deciding that when they want to intervene with a definition to try to make it all right, I think we can skip that. Because I think that changes the whole dynamic of the democracy that we're in. I also want to say that you're on, in my view, and I've been trying to be, because I really want to get to consensus, so I've been trying to be helpful on like the 16, 17 issues around student achievement and how that does or doesn't interfere with the prohibition on, that Congress has created, statutory limitations. This one also faces statutory limitations. The statute in like a gazillion different places, there are like 4 different federal statutes that prohibit where the department goes on curriculum-related topics. And so I would suggest that this one's borderline at best in terms of the way it's been written. But my biggest problem with it is that I don't think that the department should be doing us any favors on putting in a definition of academic freedom. Having said that, I am incredibly supportive of trying to push accreditors to be looking at this issue more closely. So I wish we would just focus, to be honest with you, I think this would be a much more fruitful conversation if we focused on the accreditation piece of this, which is what we're here for, rather than having circular conversations about what is academic freedom, because I think we all support academic freedom.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jake, please.
Yeah, two comments. So you're right. We didn't explicitly follow the AAUP definition. A lot of that was on me. So the use of the word undo here is giving accreditors a little bit of flexibility when interpreting whether or not an institution is following said policy. Interference broadly, if there's nothing, no guardrail there, it forces accreditors to define what interference is. By using undo, the accreditor is only looking at whether or not the institution is, aggressively, or I guess clamping down, excessively on they're excessively interfering in the process. To your other point, I don't think we're doing anything regarding curriculum design here. This is just really, again, requiring the accreditor to essentially check whether an institution is following their own academic policies. We are not telling the institutions to implement any kind of specific policy or to do anything regarding their curriculum in this case.
Thank you, Jeff. Briefly.
The statute restricts you on accreditors too in this area. So it's not just restriction on institutions, it's explicitly restricts you on accreditors as well. So I just wanted to point that out. But I also wanted to just say that it won't just be, you're not help. So by adding the word undue influence, it's not just how the accreditor interprets it. They then come before us, NASIKI, and before you. And so there's going to be this just lovely, not lovely, conversation around what is undue influence by the accreditor and the institution, by NASIKI, and I just feel like on academic freedom, I think it's really good for the federal government to say, did the accreditor kick the tires on academic freedom? Yes, they did. No, they didn't. But to get into the judgments of into really detailed conversation about the undue interference, I have a real issue with that.
Thank you, Jennifer. Magnus, you have the floor.
Thanks, Kayla. Yeah, I largely agree with Jennifer's comments both before and after the break, and I think she's articulated many of them with a level of experience and expertise that I simply don't have. So I appreciate that, Jennifer. But I think one of the areas she mentioned, there are several regulatory or statutory areas where the department is restricted from certain authority over curriculum, and I think one of those is the Department of Education Organization Act. Section 103, paragraph B says, no provision of a program administered by the secretary or by any other officer of the department shall be construed to authorize the secretary or any such officer to exercise any direction, supervision, or control over the curriculum, program of instruction, administration, or personnel of any educational institution, school, or school system, over any accrediting agency or association, or over the selection or content of library sources, textbooks, or other instructional materials by any educational institution or school system, except to the extent authorized by law. So I just wanted to put that on record, and then more broadly to answer Jeff's earlier question about concerns that are had. And I think from a student perspective, things like defining academic freedom and the concept of intellectual diversity appear to be an attempt to write accreditation standards around changing political debates. I mean, political debates ebb and flow, the pendulum swings, and we really want to make sure that these changes are ensuring that colleges are actually serving students well. And I think this may be one area that I don't think that we're reaching that goal.
Thank you, Magnus. Jeff?
Yeah. And one of the things I can say, as someone who's worked at the department over the years at many different times, first thing you learn is what the limitations of the agency are in the Department of Education Organization Act. And the key thing there is what's authorized by law. And I'll refer you to Section 496A, criteria required. No accrediting agency or association may be determined by the Secretary to be a reliable authority as to the quality of education or training offered for the purposes of this act or other federal purposes unless the agency or association meets criteria established by the Secretary pursuant to this section. And one of those criteria, as you go down, gets down to standards for faculty. So we're not defining those standards, but we do have the ability to set criteria for the recognition of agencies. And that's what we're doing here without directing control over those specific agencies.
Thank you, Jeff. Jake, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I really take umbrage with the idea that this is breaching, that protection against curriculum design. These are the institution's policies. The accreditor is just checking whether the institution is following its own policies in this case. The institution's the one doing the curriculum design. The accreditor is not telling the institution how to design the curriculum. It's just ensuring that the institution follows its own policies in regards to, speech and conduct of professors and protections regarding their research.
Thank you, Jake. Brief follow-up, Magnus, and then I'm going to move on.
Oh, no, thank you. Just wanted to get that out there.
Thank you, Magnus. Michael, you have the floor.
I'm going to reserve my comments.
Jennifer, you have the floor.
Oh, good, because I can respond to Jake. So, so I agree with everything you just said, except for that by now defining academic freedom, you're not leaving it to the accreditor and the institution. So you're disrupting that process. So I take umbrage with your portrayal, because by including the definition, you are dictating to the accreditor what they have to look at and what the schools have to do in a world in which we have always lived way before the Department of Ed. So what you described is what happens. Are they doing it well? No, they're not doing it well. Should we include a provision that explains that we really care a lot deeply about this? Yes, we should. That's literally a 3-sentence addition that talks about intellectual diversity under the fact being really clear that it fits under faculty criteria so that you don't get in trouble. And I think we may have given you that language, but if we didn't give you that language, I'm happy to draft it overnight.
Thank you, Jennifer. Let's move on. Jeff, back to you. Next section.
Okay. We're getting there. Yeah, it looks like the next, is it 60 or 63? Let's see here. Yeah. Page 63. Sorry about that. So this is related to academic freedom. Again, what Dr. Barker talked about. This is a new section on research integrity that we had added. Bottom of page 60, new paragraph O.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I am going to open it up for some questions. You okay? David, please get us started.
Thank you. And I appreciate the Assistant Secretary's remarks on this. It seems to be an important and very complicated issue where we have a lot of incentives towards doing research that, when are individually optimized, lead to a kind of tragedy of the commons and generally bad outcomes across the board. My questions are related to what's the amount of good work we can do within accreditation to address it, because I think it's arguably a bigger problem than that. Specifically, with respect to what can an institution do with mere policies. If I can call your attention on page 62, line 5, where the institutions are to enforce policies and practices to prevent, detect, and address fabrication. I'd like to suggest that might be too strong. I'm not sure that prevention is within policies is realistic, because these are people who aren't following the rules anyway. So if we make more rules, they probably won't have an effect. Detection, a little closer, but since detection requires very technical peer review kind of skills, those are probably outside the scope of the institution. They could certainly act on instances where detection has occurred. So I wonder if it wouldn't be something like discourage and address or something like that. And I guess I'll ask that question to the department.
Thank you, David. Jeff?
I think the intention here is to obviously address the problem of research misconduct overall. And so these are really illustrative examples of that. So, I think we can work some of the language there. But again, the overarching concept here is to address research misconduct.
Thank you, Jeff. Follow up, David.
Yes, thank you. So again, I'm thinking of the peer reviewer. If an instance is found and everybody knows about it, then as a peer reviewer, do I have to find them out of compliance because they didn't prevent it? That's kind of where I'm going.
Yeah, I think the issue here is whether or not an institution has policies and is following it, and those policies provide safeguards. And so I think in any instance where you have something that occurs and it wasn't detected, you'd want to sort of go back and look at your policies and see if there's anything that you could have done to make sure that doesn't happen again. Sometimes there isn't. It's just, you had no control over it. But in a lot of instances, whether it be reviews of submissions to journals and things like that, there are ways to address and to mitigate it. So I think that's really where we're coming from on this.
Thank you, Jeff. David?
Yes, thank you. Would you be open to policies and practice intended to, because that's the way policies usually work. That's the best we can do with most of them. My last comment is really just about the last sentence about artificial intelligence. The point's well taken, but that sentence may not age well. And I don't know that it's necessary in the context of the rest of it.
That's an important point. Obviously, everybody is talking about this topic and wants to make sure it's addressed, but there may be a more encompassing term that would stand the test of time when we have a new phrase to talk about automated ways of doing analysis.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, David. Mark, you have the floor.
So this is a showstopper as far as I'm concerned, because it doesn't belong in this set of regulations. And in fact, I suspect if it goes there, you will lose in the courts eventually on this. The area of research compliance, research security is already heavily regulated by the federal government through all the federal funding agencies, first and foremost. Those regulatory obligations are already not aligned. They are overly burdensome and dramatically increase the cost of overseeing research. This is adding another burden where it is not needed, it is not called for, and it is not relevant to Title IV funding, which is your primary focus. So I would basically say that this is maybe well-intentioned. It's another example where you're increasing the cost of higher education by creating new burdens and new obstacles, particularly in an area that is not directly related to your primary responsibility at the U.S. Department of Education.
Thank you, Mark. Michael, you have the floor.
Yeah, I would echo Mark's comments, and I would also go back because, Jeff, what I heard you say was what you're concerned about is whether or not institutions have policies, but that's not what this says. It says that the agency must evaluate, and not evaluate whether the policies are good or not good. They must evaluate whether the institutions maintain the integrity of research and scholarly activity. So that is an assessment metric that we would have to, as agencies, implement. Establish standards, somehow measure whether or not the research that is being produced by an institution is of a nature to have met some kind of definition of integrity or not have been fabricated, these other kinds of things. So the language as written does go further than just does the institution have policies and procedures. So that's step one, but I would again echo Mark's comments that it's still a bridge too far.
Thank you, Michael. Jennifer, you have the floor.
Yeah, I want to echo the both of them, but also add that it, in effect, because of the way it's mandated, it is in effect an additional criteria, and you are restricted by Congress to the criteria of 602.16. So the additive provision here is, in my view, statutorily problematic because you're in effect creating a criteria that doesn't exist. Having said that, I do think that there's a solution here, which again, as it relates to, and it's as appropriate too. I mean, this is written as if every institution in the U.S. is like a R1 institution or something. So that was the other issue I had with it, is it's just not applicable to vocational ed or comm colleges or so that was the other just sort of issue. But if to the extent that the department feels strongly about I mean, I would strike it, but to the extent the department feels strongly about something on this, again, it could go to the existing criteria that you do have, and in 17, which we're in, the applicability of a standard on, faculty or curriculum. You could say, as appropriate, the agency reviews the research of an institution and whatever, but again, like I could take, or we could take, what is a pretty long paragraph and turn it into probably 3 words. So.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jeff, please.
My question on that is, I'm listening to all the, comments and trying to parse out some of the different interests. Does anybody have strong objections that research ought to be or is inclusive in a agency's standards for faculty and an institution's policies with regard to faculty, that research is covered under that?
Did you want to respond to that?
At an R1 or research institution?
If an institution has, as part of its practices with regard to how their faculty are structured and promotions and their, then it would be, I think, appropriate in the context of the quality of faculty to be looking at the quality of the research done by the faculty. Not the subject matters necessarily, but the quality of the research being done is an appropriate, in my view, an appropriate piece. There's a lot of as appropriates in there.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jeff. Michael Shires, you have the floor.
Thank you. I also agree this is mostly thought about in the R1 context. And we need to think about how that affects other areas. I do think there is this implicit argument that I hear every single day we talk about higher education, that scholarship and teaching are inextricably linked, and the quality of research defines the quality of the teaching. And so in some ways, I think we need to think about what interpretations are appropriate. I'm very supportive of the idea of adding, I would add sentences, Jennifer, or words, unfortunately, Jennifer, to say, the agency must have procedures to evaluate whether institutions and programs have policies appropriate to maintain, so that it's about the institution having policies and not the accreditor enforcing it. But I do think that we need to think hard in this era, especially, and I know AI is the thing today, but it's also the tool for intellectual fraud today that has exploded on the landscape. And I think accreditors need to be responsive to that. And I think whether it's in this particular place or whether it's under the faculty piece somewhere, we probably want to create a priority for accreditors to be thinking about that and setting policies for it. So I'm supportive of including it in one of these places, but I do think it's important for us to not ignore what's happening around us while we're doing this.
Thank you, Michael. Michael, you have the floor.
Yeah, Jeff, to your question, yes, as it pertains to the overall educational quality, to the teaching and learning, of course, research is an important component of that. And so, to Jennifer's point, it isn't, it for all intents and purposes, it's included as part of the curriculum, as part of the educational product that is being delivered. So the quality of that is assessed through the way that you would do any other kind of program level review, looking at outcomes. Obviously, fraudulent research would be problematical. To Mark's point, also, if other agencies are taking action with regard to fraudulent practices or research that has significant fraud or questions around it, yes, accreditors should take those findings into account and should again conduct their own review about the academic integrity of the institution as a whole, and at the programmatic level and at the faculty level as necessary. So I think that there are other areas that it can be, that's probably already addressed and can be covered. And at a minimum, as as I said earlier, and as I think Mike Shires just said, largely it's really whether or not we can say to an institution or to an accrediting agency, does an institution have policies in this area, as opposed to can they evaluate whether or not these programs actually represent integrity?
Thank you, Michael. And your response, department, and then I'll move on.
Just quickly, I do think we need to call out research specifically, because I don't think it's inherently captured when we talk about curriculum and when we talk about faculty. We do think it's related, but we think that there's specifics that for institutions that do research, that is something that probably needs to be called out more directly.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeremy, you have the floor. Jeffrey.
Going back to week one, I see.
Uh-huh.
So in with this whole section, you asked the question about it, its applicability to faculty, et cetera. Is of the school is research-based, et cetera, then I think that could possibly make sense. There are a number of institutions, while they do go to the doctoral level, are not necessarily research-based institutions. And for the artificial intelligence, possibly another word could be adaptive technologies. Just throwing out another word.
Yeah, thank you. Those are both good points. The only thing I think we want to make sure it's clear is that you can have research being done at liberal arts institutions, for example, so they don't necessarily have to be a research institution by their mission, but a number of institutions, and not all, and we're recognizing the comments on that this doesn't apply to everybody, but a number of institutions do research that aren't necessarily quote unquote research institutions by mission.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Mark, you have the floor.
Yeah, so first I was going to make the comment you just made, Jeff. There are plenty of liberal arts institutions that do have a research component. But in the world of not only R1s, Jen, but R2s too, the world of R2s is bigger than the world of R1s. These institutions do have policies if they receive federal funding because they have to comply with the standards of the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and a whole bunch of other federal agencies that already regulate the research conduct and misconduct piece. So I would say that this at most should hold harmless in the sense that it shouldn't create a new burden, including requiring a policy or whatever. That's fine, but as written, it's gone way too far in terms of being able to enforce it as a regulator and adding additional administrative burden on the institutions. But the other piece, just to be clear, not all faculty, the institution may have research conducted. Not all faculty have research as a component of their responsibilities. So again, there's a lot of nuance and complexity here. And the last piece I'll add, which is AI will find things, AI will create things. The way this actually happens in the real world for someone who's actually dismissed tenured faculty for violating this is they get turned in by their peers. That's how it really happens. It really happens when somebody basically goes out there in a space on the internet where they are checking on each other, particularly in the very competitive fields where the research actually matters. In other words, if the results are wrong, people could die. So a lot in the life sciences. That is a self-policing mechanism. And so expecting that the institution is the only party that's involved in this is just not true. It's the federal government, it's the discipline itself, its own processes. And because quite frankly, faculty loyalty is not to institutions, it's to their disciplines. If you actually spend any time with research faculty, they are grounded in their disciplines. They're not grounded in their institutions per se. That's where their first loyalty lies. So I just think that if there's going to be anything to the research component in here, it needs to be that the institution has and is consistent with its policies. But for those institutions that have a research mission, that is already above and beyond documented through accepting federal grants and contracts from a variety of agencies. And if you could get them to harmonize, I would appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark. Jeff?
Those are good points, and I appreciate you bringing them up, Mark.
Ray, you have the floor.
Thank you. My colleague, Chancellor Duffy, asked me to make an observation and put it on the record. But before I go there, I want to say I agree with a number of statements that Mark has made. There's already a lot of federal regulation in terms of research. But Jeff, I think you phrased a good point that there's nothing within the education rules that really call out what accreditors should be looking for in terms of research. And there is, and this is the point Chancellor Duffy wanted to make sure I made, there is a nexus to Title IV because just like teaching and scholarship go together, our students are both being taught in the classroom and they're performing the research. And in both areas, whether they're in the classroom or they're graduate students doing research, many of them are paying for it with Title IV student loans that are backed by the federal government. So the point we want to make is we do think there should be something in here that addresses education. But to Mark's point, we think it should have as light a touch as possible in terms of adding to the regulatory burden.
Thank you, Ray. Michael, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mark, for that additional plug for peer review. So if I remember correctly, and I'm going back here, but there, in the 2010s, there was an issue around distance education and fraud rings. And the way that we handled it then was, I think we put some things into 668, maybe into the PPA or something along those particular lines to try to make sure that, again, that students weren't actually engaging in the education that they were enrolled in. And it was a huge issue found by the GAO. And I think that, the integrity of the program fell to the institutions and the burden to the institutions. And so, again, I would think that this is an area that the institutions have the rightful purview over and the responsibility for to be policing themselves as much as they're being policed by the accreditation community. So yes, an accreditable institution should have policies in this area. For the promotion of quality education and for the promotion of academic integrity as well. So, no real issue with requiring policies in this area, but anything beyond that is probably outside of our ken.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to go back over to Mark and then come into you, Jeff, to take us to the next section.
Okay, this is really quick, but because Michael mentioned peer review, on page 59, peer review still survives. So if you're going to change the language around reviewers, you're going to edit page 59 as well. It's item M as in yellow.
Thank you for that, Mark. And now, Michael Shires.
I support that change.
And now back to you, Jeff.
Okay, now we can go to page 63. Make sure we get there. Yeah, we can scroll. Okay. So we struck the word religious viewpoints because it's already addressed in religious mission above, on the line above.
Anything else to add before I start taking cards? Okay, Julie, you're good. AD, please.
Just wanted to thank the department. That's, I think, what we asked for. So thank you.
And now back to you, Julie.
Sorry, I just wanted to hear what AD threw out there. Not quite what I was expecting. This kind of got to me. I remember the conversation last session, but I can't help but wonder, wouldn't this matter for any university, private or otherwise? Sorry, my brain just like totally froze. So I guess my question is, why do religious accreditors get viewpoints and not everybody else? That's what I've got written in the text as my initial read. So I would love some clarity around with respect to religious viewpoints. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you want to respond or you want me to? Okay. Yeah, this is just stating that basically religious schools don't have to be viewpoint neutral under like everybody who's not religious essentially has to be viewpoint neutral here, but on the recognition that religious schools have an extreme amount of protection under RFRA and generally within, just First Amendment protections regarding freedom of religion, we don't believe that we can require viewpoint neutrality to be imposed on religious schools and accreditors to, take action against them if it's in line with their religious mission.
Thank you, Jake. Julie, did you have any follow-up?
I'm going to need to think for a second.
Okay, please do. AD, did you want to add to this as well?
Yeah, just to clarify that the what was crossed out, religious viewpoints, was based on a different discussion that the government, or in this case, agencies, no one should be trying to figure out what is a religious viewpoint versus a non-religious viewpoint of a religious accreditor, or in the case of a school. So that's why that was crossed out. It gives the religious entity the ability to assume that its viewpoints are religious. That's what that discussion was. Your other question is to the department, but for that, I just wanted to clarify.
Thank you, AD. Magnus, please.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, I mean, this is like you mentioned, Jake, a First Amendment thing, but doesn't that apply to all institutions, or at the very least private institutions, not just religious accreditors or religious institutions? So what about being non-neutral on non-religious issues? Because you could have an accreditor that has a mission of I don't know, pick something that is not religious. So I just I don't know if that's a articulate question or not.
We're going to take that one back. We'll come back and talk about, I mean, there were a number of statutes that we had to comply with regard to religious institutions. And so we can take that back and give a little bit more detailed explanation in terms of why the wording is the way it is.
Yeah, and just to give an example, one popped in my head as soon as I turned my mic off, but like HBCUs may be an example of an institution that has a specific viewpoint on something that is not necessarily religious. If that's helpful at all, it may not be.
Thank you, Magnus. Julie, did you have something additional?
But again, I'm sorry, but
No,
this
please.
is getting down to agencies' decisions that are neutral with respect to viewpoint and ideology. So unless it's specific to the mission, that's what this section is getting at.
Right. So I'm raising the question about areas that are specific to a mission that are non-religious.
Jeff, your last comment made all the additional cards go down, so we're back to you to move us along.
So I believe 68 is the next one. And I'll give Nicole a chance to get there. It's in the middle in 60220. Yep. So as Beth reminds me, this is a section that we moved based on the feedback in 16 that it's more appropriate here than it was there.
Thank you, Jeff. Jennifer?
So I think I understand that, but what is the need to add the including but not limited to language? That's where we are, right? We're on L.
Yep.
Yeah.
Again, this was to move the language that we had added that was in 60216 to require enforcement of this. And so, and as was discussed, this was a better section to include required enforcement. Understanding what you're saying is that they're following their written policy for any finding of noncompliance. This is just emphasizing including but not limited to student achievement standards.
It shows up again like a page later in 69.
Correct.
So I had the same question there. I kind of just feel like, I mean, unless you had a specific reason for why you're calling out just that criteria, I would just delete those clauses. But I just don't understand why the call out in particular, because these would apply to all of the standards. So unless there's something specific about this, like that's motivating you with regard to the student achievement standards in particular, I think you could just delete those clauses. I don't know, I'm always for less words, but.
No, we'll definitely take that back. I think, again, the point was that we had proposed additional language in 60216 and was told that this would be a better place to put it. And so this is where we had moved that to.
Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Jennifer. Jeff, I'm back over to you.
Next set of changes on page 70 down at the bottom. This deals with arbitration.
Thank you, Jeff. Michael, please.
So when we left last week, I thought we left in a pretty good spot. And this new language, not knowing, there's no note as to whether anybody around the table of the negotiators made this change, but this gets us right back to the department defining binding versus non-binding. I think we had the language that's now been stricken in 70 has been replaced with a requirement for non-binding unless after a dispute arises on a case-by-case basis, the parties can agree. I would just advocate to going back to where we left it at the end of week one. I thought that was the appropriate place to be. Again, accreditors already take on a significant risk in this process. There's no reason, there's no statutory language that requires non-binding arbitration. There are several layers of due process that exist through independent appeals, arbitration, and then institutions still have the opportunity to seek relief in the courts as well. And my agency has the case law to demonstrate that. So again, I would just advocate to go back to where we left it as of Friday at 4 when we took off the last time.
Thank you, Michael. Jeff?
So during the review of this and other topics or other transactions around this subject, the legal view on this was that institutions have a right to pursue their disputes with agencies in the federal courts, in the federal district courts. And it was presumed that if you had binding arbitration in 100% of the situations, that you were essentially taking that right away from the institutions. And so we believe that this language addresses the situation that the institution always has the ability to go to arbitration, but they also, except for the initial action and the action or any action that they agree to, they're not bound to arbitration.
Thank you, Jeff. Please, Michael.
So non-binding arbitration is essentially mediation. And if an agency is to take an adverse action that is to be upheld, having that go through and demonstrate that to the agency, to the satisfaction of an independent appeal and an arbitrator, has gone through and demonstrated that it's adhered to its policies. And the question is not necessarily whether or not it is an up and down, yes or no, the agency was right. It's, does it meet the standard for, the following its policies, did it make some, material mistake that, again, should have been captured and identified through the appeal or through the arbitration. The purpose of binding arbitration is to reduce the cost of litigation that occurs, much of it which is specious, and is just seeking to extend eligibility to continue to participate in federal financial aid for an institution that more likely than not has not been adhering to quality education practices. So I would be open to something that would say, they still, the binding arbitration doesn't necessarily prevent them from then, filing a case in federal court or whatever court, of jurisdiction is appropriate. Again, my agency went through a binding arbitration and was still sued in federal court afterwards. There's nothing that prevents an institution from taking an agency and filing that claim regardless of the outcome of the arbitration.
Jake, please.
Yeah, I mean, with due respect, I think that kind of clause obviates the purpose of binding arbitration in the first place. I mean, generally speaking, binding arbitration, if it's required in all cases, there's quite a bit of case law that such provisions are already legally suspect. However, to the extent the parties agree on binding arbitration, if you sued in federal court afterwards, you would lose on the basis that you agreed to binding arbitration. The court would just immediately look to the arbitration agreement. The problem with creating that exception is that effectively makes all supposedly binding arbitration non-binding, because you could then just sue in federal court. So we would actually be saying that all arbitration agreements are effectively non-binding. Does that make sense?
Yes. Then, my counter to that would be, what you're looking for is, and what you're enacting here also, though, is you have independent private organizations that enter into agreements with their member institutions. And those parties should be able to come to whatever agreement they so choose. All that the statute requires is for there to be arbitration, an allowance for that. And that is an eligibility criteria for institutions to participate in federal financial aid. So when the Congress put it in, they were acknowledging the importance of arbitration, again, as a measure to keep these battles out of the court system. And so you're opening up the opportunity for choice. Institutions will have the opportunity to choose which accreditor they go to. And if they choose to say, well, we don't want to go with this agency because they require binding arbitration, we'll find another, they will have the choice and the ability to do so, should such allowances exist. And so there's really, again, the choice will be there for institutions to make those decisions and to make those agreements based upon what they feel is best for their institution and for the agency.
Thank you, Michael. Jeff?
Yeah, I think when you look at 496E, the initial arbitration rule, the department's position is based on the assumption that that only applies on the initial that requirement only applies initially. And had Congress wanted to do binding arbitration, they would know how to write that, and they would write it as binding arbitration in all instances. But this is just on the any dispute involving a final denial, withdrawal, or termination of accreditation to initial accreditation prior to action. And so the structure of the statute is that it's limited. The assumption is that institutions have a right to take their cases into federal district court.
Jake, did you want to add to that? Good. Okay. Thank you. Jennifer, you have the floor.
So I'm pretty sympathetic to Michael's argument on this. And I'm just wondering, because Jeff, to your point, I'm also sympathetic to what you just said about statute, but to your point, they were silent on what type of arbitration. They didn't say non-binding in statute either. But you're adding a provision that says it must be non-binding. So you're interpreting, I mean, you're literally both just arguing about like an interpretation where Congress was silent on it. So does it help, Michael, if you don't mind my asking Michael, if they just deleted any agency arbitration must be non-binding except for the blah, blah, blah? Like if they just left it silent?
Well, you contemplate that, Michael. Jake, can we hear from you?
Yeah, that's not what it says. So it says non-binding except that the parties can agree for it to be binding. So that flexibility is still in there. It's non-binding by default, I suppose, but we're not saying that it's always non-binding.
I know, but why not just be silent and let the two parties figure it out? And let an accrediting agency, and accrediting it, to Michael's point, you're creating a free market competition accrediting market. Why not just leave it and see what is successful? I mean, it might turn out that if Michael created a binding arbitration policy, he might lose schools because schools will be like, well, I have a non-binding policy. So why not just leave it to the marketplace to determine that? Why is the federal, like, what is the federal policy for creating a non-binding policy?
No.
And I know it's a non-binding with a.
Right. Yeah. So the thing is, binding after the dispute arises. Basically, the two parties are consenting to a binding arbitration agreement after all the facts have played out. That's significant within case law. Generally speaking, and I'm having to go all the way back to my first year of contracts law, full binding arbitration agreements that apply in every case. I fully recognize the argument that, an institution could just go elsewhere. That's the exact same argument that employers have made when trying to force binding arbitration agreements in across the board, and courts have found that they're not applicable or they're not enforceable. So this is just kind of taking that step out. And by saying it's a binding arbitration that, they have to agree to after the dispute arises, that obviates that issue.
Jeff, did you want to add to that? Good to go. Okay. We are 2 minutes from the lunch hour. Do we want to cover one more section, or are we ready to break at this juncture?
We can break here.
Let's break here, take lunch, and I'll see you all back here at 1. Thank you.